The air in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was thick with the scent of Casablanca lilies and the metallic tang of expensive champagne. For Elena Vance, it was the smell of a finished job. She adjusted the silk lapel of Julian Sterling's tuxedo, her fingers grazing the heavy platinum watch she had bought him to celebrate his first billion-dollar valuation. "The Henderson merger is finalized, Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the string quartet. "The investors are happy. We can finally breathe." Julian didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on his reflection in a gilded mirror, a practiced, predatory smile stretching across his handsome face. "Correction, Elena. I can finally breathe. You still have to finalize the seating charts for next Saturday." Elena felt a slight prickle of unease. "The wedding? Julian, I've handled the logistics for our entire lives for the last 7 years. I think I can handle a seating chart. I was hoping we could sneak away for 20 minutes, just us." "Not tonight," he said, patting her hand dismissively, the way one might pet a golden retriever. "Go find the caterer. The oysters are a minute late." Elena watched him move into the crowd, the quintessential king of New York real estate. She had built that image. She had stayed up until 3 a.m. drafting his speeches. She had navigated the legal minefields of his acquisitions, and she had curated the very wardrobe that made him look like a god among men. She was the architect. He was merely the facade. An hour later, seeking a moment of silence from the suffocating heat of the gala, Elena headed toward the library. She needed to tell Julian about a small discrepancy she'd found in the legacy project filings. Nothing major, just a technicality she had secured in her own name years ago for tax purposes. She stopped at the heavy mahogany doors. They were slightly ajar. "You're being cruel, Julian," a voice purred. It was a voice Elena recognized instantly, Sienna Montgomery, the steel and velvet heiress to the Montgomery shipping fortune. "The invitations are in people's homes." "Invitations can be rescinded," Julian's voice responded, sounding more alive than it had all evening. "Elena was a necessity, Sienna. She's the engine that got me to the base of the mountain. But look at her. She's beige. She's a small-town girl who's reached her limit." Elena's heart didn't just break, it seemed to freeze in her chest, turning into a jagged block of ice. "And me?" Sienna asked. "You are the summit," Julian said. She heard the unmistakable sound of a glass being set down, followed by the rustle of silk. "I need a queen to match the empire I've built, not a secretary who thinks she's a partner." Elena pushed the door open. The light from the hallway spilled across the Persian rug, illuminating Julian's hand on Sienna's waist. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't even look guilty. He simply straightened his tie and looked at Elena with a cold, clinical detachment. "You were always better at the books than the timing, Elena," he said smoothly. 7 years, Elena said, her voice trembling but her eyes burning. "I gave you 7 years. I built Sterling Heights from a 2-room office in Queens to this. And I'm grateful, which is why I'm going to make this easy. You're fired, Elena, effective immediately. There's a severance package on your desk, and I've had your things moved out of the penthouse. My lawyer found the loophole in your partner clause. Turns out, without a marriage certificate, you're just an at-will employee." He walked past her, pausing at the door. He leaned in, his breath smelling of aged scotch. "You were great for the climb, Elena, but Sienna is who I need for the peak. Go back to your small town. Find a nice, quiet life. You were never meant for this height." Elena stood alone in the library as the sounds of the gala roared in the distance. Her hand went to her throat, feeling the empty space where she thought her future lived. Then her gaze fell on her laptop bag, tucked in the corner of the room. Julian thought he had stripped her of everything. He thought he owned the mountain, but as Elena felt the cold, hard clarity of his betrayal settle in, she remembered something he had forgotten. He owned the buildings, but she owned the blueprint, and she knew exactly where the foundation was cracked. The Blue Moon Motel smelled of lemon-scented bleach and old cigarettes, a far cry from the sandalwood and silk of the Sterling Heights penthouse. Elena sat on the edge of a bed with saggy springs, the flickering neon sign outside casting a rhythmic, bruised purple glow across her face. For 3 days, she had allowed herself to bleed. She watched the news cycles on a cracked TV screen, Julian and Sienna at a charity gala, Julian and Sienna leaving a jewelry store, Julian announcing the Legacy Project to a swarm of eager reporters. He looked triumphant. He looked like a man who had successfully shed a skin that no longer fit. "She's a small-town girl who's reached her limit," his voice echoed in her head. Elena's laptop hummed on her lap, the only piece of her former life she'd managed to grab. She didn't look at photos of their vacations or drafts of their wedding vows. She went deeper, into the encrypted folders she'd created 3 years ago when Sterling Heights was facing a hostile takeover. Her breath hitched. There it was, the Icarus strategy. It was the branding blueprint for what Julian was now calling the Legacy Project. It wasn't just a marketing plan, it was a psychological framework for luxury real estate, how to sell a lifestyle to the world's 1%ers. Julian had called it a stroke of genius. He hadn't realized that Elena, ever the strategist, had filed the intellectual property under her own shell company, Vance Creative, as a tax-saving measure he'd signed off on without reading the fine print. He hadn't fired a secretary, he had fired the owner of his company's future. Elena stood up, her grief curdling into something cold, sharp, and revitalizing. She walked to the bathroom mirror. The beige girl Julian described, with her sensible ponytail and soft, muted colors, looked back at her. She picked up the motel's complimentary sewing kit and pulled out the small, sharp scissors. With a steady hand, she sheared through her long chestnut hair. It fell into the stained sink in heavy clumps until it was a sharp, jagged bob that grazed her jawline. She scrubbed the beige makeup from her face, revealing the high, defiant cheekbones she'd been hiding to make Julian look taller, more imposing. Next, she took her last $5,000, her personal savings Julian couldn't touch, and went to a boutique in Soho. She didn't buy a wedding dress. She bought a suit, midnight black, tailored like armor, with heels that sounded like a countdown when they hit the pavement. The final piece of the strategy was the wild card. Elias Thorne's office was located in a building Julian had spent years trying to buy. Elias was the antithesis of Julian, quiet where Julian was loud, private where Julian was a peacock. He was the only man in New York Julian Sterling actually feared. Elena bypassed the receptionist with a look of such absolute authority that the young woman didn't even ask for an ID. She pushed open the double doors to Elias's office. Elias was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of neat bourbon in his hand. He didn't look surprised. He simply turned, his dark eyes scanning her new silhouette. "The rumors said you'd left town, Elena. Back to whatever picket fence fantasy Julian said you belonged to." "Julian has a habit of miscalculating the value of things he doesn't own," Elena replied, walking to his desk and dropping a flash drive on the mahogany surface. Elias arched a brow. "And what's this?" "The kill switch for the Legacy Project. Julian is about to go to his investors with a strategy he doesn't legally own. I want to offer you a partnership. You provide the capital and the platform to launch a rival project, one that uses my IP legally. We don't just beat him, Elias. We make it so he never builds so much as a birdhouse in this city again." Elias walked over, picking up the drive. He looked at her. really looked at her, not as Julian's shadow, but as a predator in her own right. "And what do you want in return, Elena? Money? A title?" Elena leaned over his desk, her eyes reflecting the cold lights of the city. "I want him to watch me take back everything I gave him, and then I want to buy his penthouse at a foreclosure auction. I left a very expensive bottle of wine in the cellar, and I'd like to drink it while I watch him pack." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Elias's face. He reached out his hand. "I've always hated that bottle of wine Julian brags about. Let's go get it." The Metropolitan Museum of Art was a fortress of glass and history, but tonight it was a battlefield. The Sterling Heights Balla was meant to be Julian's coronation, the night he officially announced the financing for the legacy project. Elena stood in the foyer, her hand resting lightly on the crook of Elias Thorne's arm. The midnight black suit she had bought felt like a second skin, the silk lining cool against her ribs. Her new, jagged haircut framed her face like a blade. "You're trembling," Elias said, his voice a low hum near her ear. He didn't sound critical, he sounded curious. "Adrenaline is often mistaken for fear," Elena replied, her eyes fixed on the grand staircase. "I've spent 7 years making sure everyone looked at Julian. It's a strange sensation being the one they're looking at now." "Get used to it," Elias murmured. "Tonight, you aren't the woman behind the man. You're the woman who's about to own the room." As they entered the main hall, a hush rippled through the crowd. The beige girl was gone. In her place was a creature of sharp angles and cold confidence. Julian was at the center of a circle of investors, Sienna Montgomery draped over his arm like a trophy. He was laughing, a flute of vintage Krug in his hand, until he saw them. His laughter died mid-breath. His grip on Sienna's waist tightened, a flash of irritation crossing his face before he masked it with a practiced smirk. He broke away from the group and marched towards them. "Elias, I didn't know you were invited to events of this caliber. And Elena," he looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her hair. "A bold look for someone who's currently unemployed. Did Elias hire you to organize his filing cabinets?" "Actually, Julian," Elias said, his presence looming over the shorter man, "Elena is my partner, in every sense that matters." Elena stepped forward, her heels clicking like a metronome on the marble floor. "I'm not here to talk about filing cabinets, Julian. I'm here to talk to Marcus Vandergeld. I believe he's still the lead investor on the legacy project." Julian's eyes narrowed. "Marcus doesn't talk to staff, especially former staff. Why don't you go find the coat check? I'm sure they could use the help." Elena didn't blink. She leaned in, her voice a sharp whisper. "I saw Marcus in the lounge 5 minutes ago. He looked concerned. Something about the intellectual property filings for the Icarus strategy. He seemed to think it was odd that your name wasn't on the copyright." The color drained from Julian's face so quickly it was almost comical. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything, Julian." Elena smiled without her eyes. "I just reminded him that while you're great at selling the summit, I'm the one who mapped the route. You told me I wasn't enough for the peak. I'm here to show you that I am the mountain, and right now you're standing on a very unstable ledge." She turned her back on him before he could respond, moving toward the VIP lounge where the city's true power players sat. For the next 2 hours, Elena was a ghost in Julian's machine. She didn't cause a scene. She didn't throw a drink. Instead, she moved from investor to investor, people she had nurtured for years. She spoke their language: ROI, branding equity, risk mitigation. To Mr. Vandergeld, she mentioned the lack of a creative license for the project's core branding.
To the pension fund managers, she hinted at the instability of Julian's new leadership without her at the helm. She wasn't just burning bridges, she was dismantling the very ground Julian stood on, brick by silent brick. By the time the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Julian was no longer the golden boy. He was a man frantically trying to hold a leaking dam. He tried to approach Elena again near the balcony, but Elias was there, a silent, immovable shadow. "This is a mistake, Elena," Julian hissed, his tie slightly crooked, his composure fraying. "Sienna's father will bury you. I'll make sure you never work in this industry again." "Julian," Elena said, looking out over the city she had helped him conquer, "you always thought you were the one holding the cards, but you forgot who dealt them." She turned to Elias. "I'm ready to leave. We have a lot of work to do before the launch tomorrow." Elias nodded, his hand finding the small of her back. As they walked toward the exit, Julian's voice rose behind them, desperate and shrill. "You're nothing without me. You're just a small-town girl playing dress-up." Elena didn't look back. She felt the cool night air hit her face as they stepped onto Fifth Avenue. "That was Phase 2, Elias said, opening the door of his sleek black town car. "Phase 3 is the kill shot. Are you ready for the launch?" Elena looked at her reflection in the car window. The woman looking back wasn't broken. She wasn't beige. She was a storm. The Legacy Project launches at 10 a.m. By 11 a.m., Julian Sterling won't even own his own name.
The boardroom at Sterling Heights was a cathedral of ego. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass, illuminating the mahogany table where the future of Julian Sterling's empire lay in a stack of crisp, white documents. The air smelled of expensive espresso and the ozone of high-end air purifiers. Julian stood at the head of the table, his chest puffed out, a signature Mont Blanc pen poised in his hand. Marcus Vandergeld sat to his right, flanked by a phalanx of lawyers and silent, obsidian-eyed investors. "Today, we don't just build a skyscraper," Julian announced, his voice booming with the practiced cadence of a conqueror. "We build a legacy. The Icarus strategy is the crown jewel of my career. It will redefine the very concept of luxury." He lowered the pen toward the signature line. Click. The heavy double doors at the end of the room swung open. The sound was sharp, cutting through the silence like a gunshot. Elena Vance walked in first. She didn't hurry. Every step of her high heels was a deliberate beat of a drum. Behind her was Elias Thorne, his presence a dark, immovable weight. Behind them was a man in a nondescript gray suit carrying a briefcase, a process server. Julian froze, the pen hovering inches above the paper. "Elena? I had security warned about you. You're trespassing." "Actually, Julian," Elena said, her voice smooth as glass and just as sharp, "I'm here to protect my property. You're about to sign a contract involving the Icarus strategy. But as of 9 a.m. this morning, a federal injunction has been served to every investor in this room." Marcus Vandergeld didn't wait. He snatched his hand back from the table as if the documents had turned into vipers. "What is she talking about, Sterling?" "It's a bluff," he hissed, though a bead of sweat was now tracing a path down his temple. "She's a disgruntled ex-employee trying to extort." "I'm the sole owner of Vance Creative," Elena interrupted, stepping up to the table. She laid a single sheet of paper over Julian's contract. It was the copyright registration, stamped and sealed. "I developed the Icarus strategy years ago. I licensed it to Sterling Heights under a specific clause that terminated upon my departure from the company. You fired me, Julian. The moment you did, you lost the right to use a single word, image, or psychological profile in that pitch deck." The room erupted. The lawyers began whispering furiously. Marcus Vandergeld stood up, his face reddening.
Julian, you told us this was proprietary to the firm. If we sign this, we're liable for hundreds of millions in intellectual property theft. Julian, wait! Julian reached out, but Vandergeld was already gathering his things. The deal is dead, Sterling, and if my legal team finds out you lied about the assets during the due diligence phase, I'll see you in court for fraud. One by one, the investors stood and filed out. Sienna Montgomery, who had been sitting in the corner watching with a bored expression, stood up last. She looked at Julian, not with love, but with the cold calculation of a woman who had just seen a bad investment. "Sienna, babe, wait!" Julian pleaded, his voice cracking. "I can fix this. I'll buy the rights back from her. I'll—" Sienna pulled her hand away from his touch. "With what money, Julian? Your stock is going to crater the moment this hits the press. My father warned me you were all flash and no foundation. It turns out the foundation was just Elena." She walked past Elena, giving her a brief, respectful nod, and vanished through the doors. Julian sank into his leather chair, the silence of the room deafening. He looked small. The king was sitting in a kingdom of paper and broken promises. "Why?" he whispered, staring at the table. "I offered you a life people would kill for." "You offered me a seat at the back of the room." Elena leaned over him. She could smell the sour scent of his panic. "I built this mountain, Julian. You just stood on my shoulders and told the world you were flying." 2 months later, the auction was a quiet affair, held in a sterile room downtown. Sterling Heights had declared bankruptcy after the stock plummeted and the fraud investigations began. Elena sat in the front row, Elias next to her. When the gavel fell, it wasn't just a company she bought, it was the entire Sterling portfolio, including the penthouse. She bought it for pennies on the dollar using the capital Elias had helped her secure, and the settlement Julian had been forced to pay to avoid jail time. That evening, Elena stood on the balcony of the penthouse. The city glittered below like a carpet of diamonds. The wind caught her short hair, and she felt lighter than she had in a decade. A knock sounded at the door. It was Julian. He looked haggard, his designer suit wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. "Elena," he said, his voice trembling, I've been thinking. We were a great team. The best. I made a mistake with Sienna. I see that now. Let's put this behind us. We can restart the company together. We can get married, just like we planned. I'll make you a full partner this time. I promise." Elena looked at Julian, the man she had once thought was her entire world. She felt no anger. She felt no longing. She felt only a profound sense of pity. "You're right about one thing, Julian," said Elena softly. "I'm a partner. In fact, I'm the new CEO of Thorne Vance Holdings, which makes you my landlord." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small pre-written envelope. "This is your eviction notice. You have 24 hours to remove your things. I've already had the wine cellar cleared out." Julian stared at her, his mouth hanging open. You can't do this. I made you." "No, Julian," Elena said, stepping back and beginning to close the heavy mahogany door. "I made you, and now I'm unmaking you." She shut the door on his shouting. Elias walked out of the kitchen, 2 glasses of the expensive wine she had left in the cellar in his hands. He handed one to her, his fingers lingering against hers. The look in his eyes wasn't one of possession, but of genuine, quiet respect. "To the new mountain," he said, raising his glass. Elena clinked her glass against his. She turned back to the view of New York. For 7 years, she had been the woman behind the man, but as she looked out at the skyline, she realized she was no longer looking up at the summit. She was the one looking down.